بیننده عزیز سلام، من سامی مهدی هستم و شما نخستین مناظره آمو را.
I am Sami Mahdi and you're watching the very first Amu debate from Amu TV. Although the Doha Agreement was signed during the first Donald Trump administration, President Trump has been a fierce critic of how the US forces pulled out of Afghanistan. Now that the Taliban are back to power and President Trump is back to the White House, what are his policy options on Afghanistan and the Taliban, and how these potential policy options would impact Afghanistan and the people? To discuss this question, here at the Cherry Blossom Banquet Hall in Sterling, Virginia,
ما امروز در تالار چری بلاسم در استرلینگ ویرجینیا مهمانان عزیز داریم. آقای رونالد نیومن سفیر.
We have Ambassador Roland Newman, Ms. Mitra Mehran, women's rights activist,
شناخته شده حوزه حقوق بشر و حقوق زنان، خانم لیزا کورتیس معاون پیشین شورای،
Ms. Lisa Curtis, former senior director for South and Central Asia, and Dr. Ali Ahmad Jalali, former Minister of Interior.
پیشین داخلی افغانستان هستند. همه خوش آمدین. My first question is to you, Mr. Ambassador.
I was afraid of that.
Where Afghanistan stands in American foreign policy today, and what are American vital interests in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, I have to say I am long out of government, so I speak only for myself. And I think as much as possible, I want to speak to you about what I understand the Trump administration thinks more than what I think they should think. When you say, where does Afghanistan stand with this administration? It's more like, where does it sit or where does it lie? It's very low. They are very busy with other issues. Gaza, Ukraine, Iran talks. This is not high in the administration's priorities and not something for which they wish to spend a great deal of what I would call political capital. They do identify certain interests, particularly counterterrorism, also the release of some small number of hostages. But this is a transactional administration, and I would say that you have to be very careful. There is not a policy yet. There is a policy review which is still going on, and it has not gone up to the level of the president. So everything is a little bit tentative, I would say. But there are no senior people, as far as I know, that are really working on Afghanistan. And so maybe I should just stop at that point. The first part of your question, where does it stand in interests? Very low.
Yeah, okay.
I wish I had a happier answer to give you, and I'm afraid that most of my answers are not going to be any happier. But maybe my friend Ali Jalali will have happier answers.
I think our audience are interested to know the reality instead of happy answers.
I'm afraid I'm here, unfortunately, to be a reality check.
Yeah, thank you. So, Lisa, I wanted to ask you, what are major priorities for President Trump's government on Afghanistan, and is it mostly interested in releasing the hostages, the minerals, or the background base? What is really on the top priority of President Trump's list on Afghanistan?
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here today. I'm afraid I'm not much more optimistic than the ambassador. What I will say is this. Yes, Afghanistan is not a priority for the Trump administration at this time. Should it be? I would say yes. the U.S. cannot afford to ignore or look away from Afghanistan. There are several fundamental U.S. national security interests tied up in Afghanistan, the number one being terrorism threats. Even though terrorism is not getting as much attention as, say, strategic competition with China, Russia's Ukraine war, or the Middle East, what's happening in the Middle East, it's one of those issues that you have to keep your eye on, because it can, come up and, rise its ugly head at any time. And, Afghanistan still has Al-Qaeda leaders. There's ISIS-K is very much in Afghanistan, which has, shown how much of a threat it is to the global community. The TTP is in Afghanistan, so there's so many different terrorist groups operating out of Afghanistan still, and this time with support. When we had, the former Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, they were fighting hand in hand with the U.S. against these terrorist groups. Now they are there, and so this is a threat. The way civil society is being, rights are being trampled on, especially women and girls. What's happening to the women and girls of Afghanistan is absolutely unacceptable. And, it's morally unacceptable for the U.S. to simply turn its back when the U.S. had invested hundreds of millions in empowering these women and girls to believe they were going to have a different life, that their rights mattered. So there is what I think are fundamental U.S. national security interests in Afghanistan. What the Trump administration thinks is a very different story.
And what is that story?
Well, that story, I think you're right. So far, we've seen that President Trump was very interested in getting the U.S. citizens out of Taliban custody. I'm very happy that 4 U.S. citizens have been released since January. However, I am worried about the transactional approach. And, in exchange, the U.S. has removed the bounties on senior Haqqani network leaders. Also, we've seen very little mentioned about human rights or women from this Trump administration. So I do worry that it will be a transactional approach, and I think this would be a big mistake. I think that any moves that we would make with the Taliban need to be conditioned on their treatment of the people of Afghanistan, especially women and girls. So those are my concerns. We've yet to see any kind of real policy emerge from the Trump administration. And I'm sorry to say, I'm not holding my breath that we're going to see some grand strategy or approach to the country. I think it's going to be driven by whatever is happening that day. The crisis of the day.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. We will, of course, turn back. Dr. Seb, شما وزیر داخلی افغانستان بدین و
Dr. Jalali, you have been a professor of defense studies and former interior minister in Afghanistan. There are at least 3 conflicts in our neighborhood and the broader region: India and Pakistan, Russia and Ukraine, and Gaza and Israel. At this point, why United States should pay any attention to Afghanistan? What importance Afghanistan has for the US, if any?
Some of the views I express are my personal opinions and in no way reflect the views of the US government or the US Department of Defense. Every country, every regime, and every institution shapes its foreign policy and strategy based on its own interests, specifically the interest of its leadership. These interests and priorities evolve over time. Regarding the current situation, as you mentioned, Afghanistan must be studied within the context of the current international community, as well as its historical background. If we look at the United States, as Ambassador said, their current priorities have shifted. However, their position on Afghanistan has remained consistent. If we examine the US national security policy and a strategy from 2017 during President Trump's administration and compare it to that of 2022 under President Biden, we find no fundamental change. They have clearly stated that Afghanistan must never again become a hub for exporting terrorism. The policy remains unchanged and the concern is still valid. However, the means by which this policy is pursued is a different matter. The policy remains the same, but the strategy has changed. The priorities have shifted, and the methods of implementation differ. In terms of the US strategy to combat terrorism, two major differences can be observed in the current circumstances. First, the nature of terrorism originating from Afghan soil has changed. Terrorism is no longer being exported solely from Afghanistan. It also exists in the Middle East, in Europe, and in other regions. Today, a person can be radicalized virtually in various parts of the world, even though the ideological center may remain in a specific location. Second, the tools available for counterterrorism have changed. It is no longer necessary to maintain a constant military presence in a particular location to combat terrorism there. Advanced technologies and military capabilities can now be utilized instead. Furthermore, the terrorism that currently exists in Afghanistan poses a threat not only to the United States but also to Europe, Russia, and the broader region. These countries are also interested in combating terrorism. Thus, counterterrorism efforts today are no longer bilateral, but multilateral, and the US places a special importance on this collaborative approach. However, if we consider the historical perspective, Afghanistan has never been a core priority for the United States. Whenever the US has perceived a threat originating from Afghanistan, it has taken action in various forms. But overall, Afghanistan has not been a strategic priority for America.
You mean if the 9/11 attacks didn't have happened?
اگر 11 سپتامبر اتفاق نیفتاد گمان نمیکنید که امریکا مداخله میکرد در افغانستان.
If the events of September 11 had never happened, I believe the US wouldn't have intervened in Afghanistan. Similarly, if the Soviet Union had not invaded Afghanistan, I doubt the US would have supported the opposition forces. Such interventions are tied to shifting American priorities and are often temporary. Even now, this pattern continues. Afghanistan has no significant trade relationship with the US, nor does it lie on any major American trade routes. From the American perspective, there are other countries more directly concerned with Afghanistan: Russia, Pakistan, and the Central Asian states. All face similar security issues. Currently, the most dangerous groups, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Taliban, Pakistan, pose significant threats to Pakistan, Russia, and Iran.
You don't see the Taliban as a threat anymore.
While these threats exist and also concern the US, but the United States has the resources to fight it. And in the meantime, it should also involve other nations to fight terrorism multilaterally.
خانم مهران، سه مهمان ما بیشتر مسائل امنیتی یعنی دید امنیتی داشتن به قضیه افغانستان. اگر تهدیدی هم متوجه امریکاست گویا از زاویه امنیتی باید ببینیم و اگر منافع
Ms. Mehran, our three other panelists see Afghanistan from a security prism or lens, and they suggest that one should see the US interest and any threat to the US from Afghanistan from a security point of view. But you are a human rights activist. Do you think systematic violation of women's rights and human rights by the Taliban in Afghanistan could make the country a priority for the new Donald Trump's administration?
دولت آمریکا و اداره فعلی آمریکا نگرانی داره این ممکن است که افغانستان رو بتونه تبدیل به یک اولویت دولت آمریکا بسازه، چون در افغانستان به صورت سیستماتیک حقوق بشر بخصوص حقوق زنان داره نقض میشه.
تشکر بسیار زیاد. خب چونچه سخنرانای قبل از ما برای این مورد تاکید کردن که امریکا دیگر در اولویت افغانستان دیگر در اولویت سیاسی در پالیسی خارجی سیاستی امریکا نیست. اما
Thank you. As previous speakers have emphasized, Afghanistan is no longer a priority in U.S. foreign policy. However, unfortunately, since 2021, various aspects of life in Afghanistan have been deeply affected by the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Even during the Trump administration, new policies regarding immigration, humanitarian aid, and development assistance, especially those targeting institutions and underground schools, had a widespread impact on Afghan society. The civil resistance movements against the Taliban, which were independently led by the Afghan people themselves, were also significantly undermined. To this day, the United States has not adopted a clear and concrete policy in support of these civil rights activists. We advocate for a policy centered around human rights values. While it is claimed that work on such a policy is underway, I believe that alongside security concerns and counter-terrorism efforts, what transpired in Afghanistan has severely damaged America's global image. The negotiations the United States held with the Taliban excluded not only women, but the entire Afghan population from any role in determining their future. In my view, these talks were not solely the legacy of either the Republicans or the Democrats. Both parties played a role. The agreement was signed during President Trump's first term, a Republican administration. What has been left behind in Afghanistan as a result of U.S. involvement is a regime of gender apartheid. Even in the context of counterterrorism, I believe that if the root causes are not addressed, the current approach of the U.S. government could mirror that of 2001 and the Bonn Conference, focusing narrowly on security and military issues without deeper analysis of how Afghanistan might again become a hub for terrorism production. Moreover, if human rights and women's rights are treated as entirely separate from security policy, I believe that would be a fundamental mistake and an ineffective strategy. Yes, women in Afghanistan have been stripped of their basic rights. They have been dehumanized as half of the population. They are banned from education, from work, and from participation in public life. This is a stain on U.S. foreign policy, and I am certain it has harmed America's reputation worldwide. I hope American policymakers reflect deeply on this. Another important point is that even if boys are allowed to attend school and men can work and move freely in public, the Taliban have changed the curriculum. The amount of money the Taliban invest in building madrasas that promote radicalization is not limited to inside Afghanistan. Pakistan, too, faces similar challenges, but unlike Afghanistan, the Pakistani state retains some capacity to restrict terrorism within its borders. Terrorism in Pakistan may not pose a regional threat in the same way, but the Taliban regime, rooted in radical ideology, has the potential to become a global threat.
دینی است او میتونه تهدید جهانی شود که من فکر نکنم حتی حضور گروه‌های دیگه در دیگه کشورها بتونه باشه.
تشکر. Ambassador Newman, there is a full-scale gender apartheid regime in power in Afghanistan. It's called gender apartheid by UN experts, by several American officials, and by human rights activists like Ms. Mehran and others. Do you think the ideology behind this gender apartheid regime could have some security consequences for the region and for the United States? Because there's an ideology behind this gender apartheid, which is radicalization. What do you think about that?
It's an interesting question. First of all, I certainly agree with Ms. Maram that our turning our back on the women of Afghanistan is a huge moral blot on the United States. I wish I could say the Trump administration cares about that. I'm not so sure about that. But I personally think this is a huge disgrace. I think we have a huge debt, not just because people may have fought with us, but we spent 20 years getting people to agree with a world view of the place of women and the importance of rights. Will this become a larger issue? Maybe in two different ways. One is in American domestic politics, it is much more important to the Democrats than it is to Republicans. Although there are strong Republicans who are strong believers in the rights of women, but they are essentially afraid of losing their position, and so they are silent. After the next election, in a year and a half, if you have Democrats coming back to a larger role in the Congress, that may play, it may play a role, but it will be mostly in terms of criticizing the administration, not in actually producing action. Does the role of women play a security role in the region? I think I defer to my friend and colleague Ali Jalali, who's Maram, on that kind of issue. I personally doubt it. Insofar as it represents a piece of a larger radical ideology, yes, certainly, that is a threat, because if that expands in the region, then all kinds of other things expand with it, which are there's certainly a security danger to every government of every regional state. And I think the governments understand that. So in that regard, it manifests a threat.
Thank you. Ms. Cortes, you were, of course, part of the negotiations team on Doha deal with the Taliban. President Trump said on, I think, February 26, I mean, after assuming office for the second time, that he wanted to keep the Bagram airfield, and he wanted to keep around 5,000 troops in Afghanistan to keep Bagram. Was it really part of the policy or thinking when you were in the administration during Trump's first administration?
Well, you remember how at the end of the first Trump administration, President Trump wanted to pull all U.S. forces out of Afghanistan. He stated it right after the election. But it was only because his advisors, people like then National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, then Secretary of State Pompeo, and then Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, before he left, they all were counseling him not to do that, to keep a small force in Afghanistan. They were successful in convincing him to keep 2,500 troops. So when Biden came into office on January 20th, 2021, there were around 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. Maybe a little bit more, but that was the stated goal, to be down to 2,500 troops by the time Trump left office.
Keeping Bagram.
No, President Trump wanted to fully withdraw from Afghanistan. He stated that on many occasions. Now, he was convinced by his advisors not to do that. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure in August 2021, when he saw the disastrous withdrawal of the Biden administration, he probably was very happy that his advisors convinced him to keep some troops in Afghanistan. But, I think he got lucky in a way, because he did not get his wish to fully withdraw all U.S. forces.
I think there is a puzzle among people, especially in Afghanistan, and they really want to know if President Trump is serious about Bagram, or it is just another excuse to criticize the Biden administration.
I think it's just another way to club the Biden administration. He can say now after the fact, yeah, I would have never taken U.S. troops, or I would have never handed Bagram over. It's easy for him to say now, but I think we should be very cautious in believing that kind of rhetoric.
I think there may be some in the administration who think there would be a use to having Bagram.
Well, of course, like I said, President Trump's advisors were advising things of this nature.
So you
President
think,
Trump, and it's a different group now. He doesn't have the same advisors that he had.
but you think maybe now the new advisors think that maybe they should keep
There's some,
So
background.
can I say something?
yeah, you better.
There is no way the Taliban is going to allow U.S. forces to come back to Bagram. It's not happening. It's a waste of time to even talk about it.
Yeah.
This is something that's not in the cards.
It's not just Bagram. He mentions Bagram because of the proximity to China, but also he mentions all the weapons, the weaponry left in Afghanistan.
Yeah, he wants the weaponry back. He thinks it was a major mistake to leave all that weaponry behind. But again, is the Taliban going to actually hand over that weaponry back to the United States?
The question is how serious he is about that.
Not serious enough to do what a great many Afghans are thinking about.
Yeah, I think
I
I
think that's
wouldn't
the bottom
read too
line.
much into his statements on the weaponry, or if he has even said anything about Bagram. I think that look, I understand that Afghans were very hopeful. They thought President Trump's going to have a different strategy on Afghanistan. I think there was hope that he might be tougher on the Taliban because they were very frustrated with President Biden. But I think the reality is, Afghanistan is not a priority for President Trump. I think, let's look at some of the things that are happening. We were talking about women. Secretary of Defense Hegseth has said he wants to get rid of the Women, Peace and Security Act of Congress. Now, he can't do that. It's law. But, not only, is there not interest in helping Afghan women, there are questions about commitment to supporting women globally from this administration. Okay, that's one reality. The second is that in the foreign assistance cuts, there's concern that even the money supporting scholarships for women and supporting, the American University of Afghanistan, whether that's going to be cut. There are even the smaller steps and programs, there are threats they're going to be cut. Let's talk about Afghans here in the United States. The administration has taken away temporary protected status for tens of thousands of Afghans here in the United States. So to me, that is the disaster in the making of the Trump administration. So, President Trump has criticized Biden for a chaotic and disastrous withdrawal. I see the potential for a lot of mistakes on Afghanistan from this Trump administration, from what I've seen so far.
Okay, so let me turn to Dr. Jalali. How Trump's messaging is received by the Taliban? When he talks about weaponry, when he talks about background, and when the Trump administration spokespersons call the Taliban a terrorist regime, a terrorist group, how is it perceived by the Taliban?
Well, let me first make a comment about the earlier question. I was one of the senior advisors with the Afghanistan Study Group. The Afghanistan Study Group, a bipartisan group by Congress, that the mandate was that to study the situation in Afghanistan and make a recommendation, policy recommendation to the administration and also to the Congress. If the Doha agreement, succeeds, what should be the policy of the United States? If it fails, what should be the policy of the United States? This Afghanistan Study Group actually worked for 1 year. And the final report was released in February 2021. And that's a very, elaborate report. It is available online. I believe that, but the conclusion of that report was that if the withdrawal of the U.S. troops is calendar-based, Afghanistan government cannot survive. If the withdrawal is conditioned to the agreement between the two parties, Afghan government and the Taliban, to reach a political settlement, then peace can pursue, then the United States can withdraw its forces peacefully. That was the recommendation at that time. That was February 2021. And then there was a question that was raised that, okay, there was an agreement in Doha by under President Trump, yes, that the U.S. troops will leave Afghanistan in 14 months. You cannot change that. But it was because the Taliban did not, fulfill what was the commitment that they made. So
under the Doha agreement.
In Doha,
yeah.
They were just running the clock.
Yeah.
And it was not verifiable what they were saying. That, okay, we will talk to the Afghan government, and when we are not going to monopolize power and so on and so forth. But nobody actually thought that it should be a kind of a benchmark, a symmetrical benchmark. Symmetrical benchmark was this, that, okay, you do something, we will do something. The troops will withdraw step by step when the other side is also make good on their commitments. And also, the Pakistan should do the same thing. Step by step, remove the Taliban bases from Pakistan. That didn't happen. So, therefore, what happened in Afghanistan on this basis, it was not the number of troops, that how many troops should stay or not. The Bagram was not an issue. The Taliban actually agreed only to talk to the United States that they will remove all troops from Afghanistan. They will be including the army, the air force, the contractors, all of them. That was a part of the agreement. So Bagram was not an issue there, and is not going to become an issue. Nobody can expect that under all these conditions, where Afghanistan is not a priority, somebody will go and seize control of Bagram, and just because China is doing testing nuclear weapons in Xinjiang and Uyghur Autonomous Region. These are things that you have to put in the context. When the new administration came, some members of the administration, actually rightfully, it was criticizing the Taliban. People thought that, okay, these people are here now, the policy will change. Policy are not made by individuals, policy made by interests, by system. That's the thing.
Okay. Our audience is inside the hall. Do you have any questions?
My question is for Ms. Lisa. Why has U.S. policy on Afghanistan remained unclear since Kabul's fall? And what internal challenges have affected the policy-making process in previous administration and Mr. Trump's administration?
Well, that's a big question, and we actually have an Afghanistan War Commission that was mandated by Congress and is currently working over the next couple of years to look very closely at U.S. policy toward Afghanistan for the 20 years that the U.S. Was there in Afghanistan. And they are holding hearings on Capitol Hill, they're doing a lot of research, and they'll ultimately come out with a report that gets into the details, because it's an extremely complicated question, and many people have been exploring that. It has something to do with probably, we had so many different military commanders in Afghanistan. They were always under pressure to, give the impression that, we were close to defeating the Taliban, or things were going in a good direction when maybe they perhaps were not. I also think that when it comes to U.S. assistance, that was not done in a correct way. There was, a lot of money right after 9/11 sort of thrown at Afghanistan, and I think it did contribute to some of the corruption issues that ended up coming up in the country. So there were a lot of mistakes made. I think there were mistakes made on the Afghan side as well that I won't get into. But if, I can talk specifically about the time that I was in government from 2017 to 2021 during the first Trump administration. And the problem then in the way the US Taliban talks were conducted was that they were never meant to exclude the Afghan government. The decision was made, and this, you can read this in the New York Times, the decision was made in the summer of 2018 that the US would start talks with the Taliban to sort of, kick off the process, but that the Afghan government would be, quickly included in that process. The thinking was never that the Afghan government would be kept out of the entire process the entire time.
But that was
that is what ended up happening, and I would frankly blame our US negotiator. And I think that unfortunately the Afghan government's interests were not fairly represented in those talks. The US should have had, more of a mediation role and should have allowed, the both sides to be represented in those talks.
Okay.
So I would say what the Doha agreement was, is it was a withdrawal agreement. It was basically the United States coming to an agreement with the Taliban that they would not kill US forces on their way out of the country. It was not a peace agreement. US withdrawal was never directly linked to a final peace agreement in the country. And I think that there were too many concessions given too early in the US Taliban talks in terms of forcing former President Ashraf Ghani to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners who later went on to fight the Afghan government. So there were a lot of flaws in that US Taliban negotiations process that I have spilled a lot of ink over and talked a lot about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
دیگه دوستا در تالار سوال آقای آروین.
از خانم کورتس میپرسم که همه مهمانان اینجا گفتن که افغانستان دیگر در اولویت سیاست‌های خارجی آمریکا قرار نداره.
I would like to ask Ms. Curtis. All the guests here have said that Afghanistan is no longer a priority in US foreign policy. However, we see that diplomatically, the level of US engagement has not declined compared to the time of the Republic. The US still maintains an embassy for Afghanistan, albeit based in Qatar. It still has a special representative for Afghanistan. And according to SIGAR data, billions of dollars have flowed into Afghanistan over the past 3 years. Taken together, these facts suggest that the US has not entirely turned away from Afghanistan. What does this mean? Does the US still want to engage with Afghanistan in some form without officially recognizing the Taliban? What is behind the continued presence of these US diplomatic structures focused on Afghanistan?
تعامل داشته باشه بدون اینکه طالبان را به رسمیت بشناسه، یعنی پشت این همه دستگاه‌هایی که آمریکا برای افغانستان داره چی میتونه باشه؟
I'm sure Ambassador Newman's going to have something to say on this as well, but so I take the point that Afghanistan gets mentioned more than other countries. I guess it's a relative question. Clearly, Afghanistan is not the priority that it was, from 2001 to 2020. But it does still receive some attention, some mention, and in terms of the assistance, you're right. The U.S. provided a lot of assistance from 2021 to 2024. I think most of that has been cut off by the Trump administration, so that's a change. And then his last point, I think there are concerns that the Trump administration may, move in a direction where they become more comfortable in legitimizing the Taliban in exchange for cooperation on, say, counterterrorism issues. I think that's a big concern, because I think the Biden administration did one thing right, and that was conditioning any recognition to the Taliban on its treatment of women and girls. And there was no way they were going to recognize the Taliban when women over the age of 12 could not go to school, when women could not work, women could not freely move around the country. So I would hope that we would see the same kind of commitment by the Trump administration, but we don't know. And again, we come back to that idea. Yeah, I think I'm negative on that point. But I guess the final point I want to make is that the U.S. really needs to condition its engagement with the Taliban on its treatment of Afghan women and girls.
Okay.
What's happening is atrocious, and it's also connected to the overall terrorism question. The worse women and girls are treated in Afghanistan, the more radicalized, the more extreme society is going to be, and the more the environment will foster the growth of extremist and terrorist groups.
That was my question before.
I think there's something here that's very important, because there are many people, I'm sure some of them in this audience, who desperately want a more active United States policy, who hope that the kind of things that Lisa's talking about will lead the administration to action. I wish it were so. But I think that is not a good understanding of what is likely to happen. This administration, as Lisa pointed out earlier, is not very interested in women. I want to be very careful here, because they have not finished defining a policy. But what I hear from people is they have an interest in counterterrorism. They have an interest in hostages. That is likely to, they haven't decided, but that can lead them to more interactions with the Taliban.
Okay.
They also seem to have a view that other things are not going to change very much. And therefore, they don't have a policy yet. I keep saying that. But my guess is they will not let an inclusive government or the role of women stand in the way if they think they can get counter-terrorist cooperation, maybe minerals.
But the question is, when the Trump administration calls the Taliban a terrorist group, right? The State Department spokesperson called the Taliban a terrorist group. How can you have a cooperation with a terrorist group to counter other terrorist groups?
Easy.
Is that possible?
You just do it. You're looking for an ideological, an intellectual consistency, which does not exist. They will go on talking about.
In the real life, how is it
in
possible?
the real life, it does not exist. They will talk about them as a terrorist group. They can cooperate with them. But look, Afghanistan is full of people who have worked with others on the basis of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. This has been a very common feature throughout Afghanistan's history. Why do you find it so strange that anybody else would not follow the same path? When you have an enemy and you have somebody who is the enemy of the enemy, you will work with the enemy of the enemy.
As an activist who have been advocating for the past 3 years, and I'm sure hopefully many women and girls and people of Afghanistan are going to see this panel, and as an activist and advocate, I believe even if there are certain policies that are set, we should be able to change it or influence it. So it doesn't mean, and it shouldn't mean, that only because if our understanding is there is a policy or there is more interest within the Trump administration on counterterrorism or detainees, that remains the only policy about Afghanistan, and we don't do anything about it to change that. So when I do a lot of engagements with Congress these days, what I notice is that we as Afghans should speak about it ourselves. There is not a strong lobby group within Congress, for example, to work on that. But then also when you are in hell and then you go to the administration, you see a differences. There is no attitude or aptitude within the Congress for the recognition or for normalization of the Taliban. And then as much as it's bad and not nice to hear that there is no foreign policy still organized or shaped for Afghanistan, but there is also an advantage about it. If there is no policy, how much, and it's under review and it's getting shaped, how we can influence that policy, right? So I think that is very important to consider, that women's rights, even if we are speaking about counterterrorism, how women, peace and security, that is a public law inside US as one of the first countries, how we can make sure, oblige them to consider that within the policy they shape or organize for Afghanistan.
Yeah.
So that's why if I think we shouldn't just say because there is something said there, Afghanistan shouldn't do anything, or we shouldn't do anything about it, or that shouldn't change. I think because the panel is rethinking the US policy on Afghanistan, we should critically analyze other areas that we think can be influenced. And even within the counterterrorism, yes, interest of United States as a government is very important, but we should be smart enough as people of Afghanistan how we can then define our interest within those interests, even within if it's Trump interest in the current situation that I think hopefully we're going to discuss it in detail.
Absolutely.
In the second.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that intervention. Dr. Jalali, counterterrorism is being mentioned in this panel several times. The question is if Taliban could be a reliable partner for the US as to fight terrorism in Afghanistan. Do you think they can be a partner for the United States to fight back Al-Qaeda, to fight back ISIS, or and some other groups?
Thank you. I think you have to look at the situation now. The United States has been, engaging the Taliban on the counterterrorism issues for the past 2 or 3 years. And because there's an understanding that Daesh is the most dangerous terrorist groups that has a reach in Central Asia, Europe, and Russia, Iran, and Pakistan. It is based now under Salamullah Ghafari in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And they can actually reach targets in the region, maybe also and beyond. And Taliban are fighting the Daesh. They are enemies. As Ron said, the enemies of my enemies and my friend, that actually there are some people supporting that engage the Taliban in order to fight the Daesh or to degrade the Daesh. Even the diplomatic mission of United States in Qatar recently said that they have degraded the impact of the effectiveness of Daesh to somehow the Taliban. But actually the Daesh also were fought by the Afghan government, also the United States too. And that's one area that the United States have been...
But, sorry to interrupt, but there are some reports also suggesting that some members of the Taliban are converting to Daesh.
Of course. That's the other issue, why this current situation in Afghanistan can spawn new problems. That is when you have a totalitarian regime like you have in Afghanistan, you govern by controlling every aspect of life in Afghanistan. There's unemployment, the economic situation in a crisis, and socially people are divided, social politically divided. Then let's create an environment for extremist groups to nourish and then to influence the society. Yes, I think there were reports that some of the Taliban who were not satisfied with whatever was going, they are joining Daesh. But still Daesh is Daesh.
Yeah.
then as long as Taliban can be used against Daesh, you actually engage them.
And you think
on
that,
the other hand,
and you think Taliban are being used effectively against Daesh by the U.S.?
Well, I think the reports say that since the Taliban, theoretically, since the Taliban are fighting Daesh, then it is good to engage them on this issue. On the other hand, Taliban actually claim that they have restricted the movement of other terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, like Turkestan, East Turkestan, the Islamic movement, like Uzbek movement. And those countries are engaging the Taliban on these. China is engaging the Taliban. Uzbekistan is engaging the Taliban. Russia is engaging the Taliban. Basically for the same reason. So why the United States should not engage the Taliban on this issue?
Do you think Taliban are becoming like Pakistan number 2? Like there was a time Pakistan would harbor all these terrorist groups, and people, I mean countries in the region and the world would engage with Pakistan for their interest. Do you think Taliban are replacing Pakistan in that sense?
I don't know about that. I know only one thing, that Pakistan for years thought that with supporting the Taliban, they will have a strategic depth in Afghanistan. Now it is the opposite. Pakistan has become the strategic depth for the extremist groups based in Afghanistan. And TTP is one thing. TTP is the most dangerous groups and very active group in Pakistan. And the attacks in Pakistan by TTP is on the rise. On the other hand, Taliban are not willing or not capable to rein in the TTP, because if they rein in the TPP, they go after the TTP, they lose other control within the movement. So it is a major problem for Pakistan. So TTP is based partly in Afghanistan. And therefore, Pakistan is becoming a strategic depth for the extremist groups in Afghanistan.
Thank you so much. Question? Pardon,
I have a question for Professor Jalali. As you all said that right now there is no priority in the US, also in the European countries for Afghanistan. And also we know that human rights, women's rights, education, these are some things that we have in thousands of books, but they are not something to be acted. And also as we have in Farsi said, Dusat Guftar Narzat Banimi Kirdar, which means if there are 200 voices, but there is no action, it doesn't worth anything. I want to ask about how can we create priorities for the future of Afghanistan. As we know, some priorities would be basically based on economics, geopolitics, but right now Afghanistan doesn't have those capability. How we, as the people of Afghanistan, for the sake of the future of Afghanistan, can create some kind of mutual interest and some strategic engagement, some strategic priority for the future of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we have discussed this earlier. We don't say it is not priority. We have the lower priority now, compared to in the past. I think it does not mean that when the major interest or major, concern as counterterrorism issues, that Afghanistan should not become the hub of terrorism, international terrorism again. It does not mean that the United States has not forgotten other issues, that the humanitarian issues, the human rights issues, but what can you do about it? That's the issue. With I think in the past 4 years, or almost 4 years, Afghanistan, the United States was the major donor of humanitarian assistance to Afghanistan. Of course, it's through other the United Nations and NGOs, other institutions, was delivered to Afghanistan. At the same time, the United States did not recognize the Taliban as a responsible, legitimate government so far. So it means that you have to put these all in a larger context. What can be done, what cannot be done, what can be feasible, what cannot. But it does not mean that the human rights issue is forgotten in the United States. If you look at the Congress is more active in this area. So when I say the priorities, it is the level of priorities that I'm saying that has been degraded in relation to the past. However, when I always actually had the concern as Afghanistan always have thought that the world has a moral responsibility for Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a small country, poor country, but at peace with itself and with others. What happened, my friend David Isby, his book is the Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. But we disagree on this. I said Afghanistan is the graveyard of Afghans themselves and is a victim of empires. So Afghanistan became the victim of empires. One superpower came and infiltrated that country and occupied it, destroyed it. The other superpower, in order to fight it, brought all these unwanted elements to fight the Soviet Union. And then when they walked away, Afghanistan is a different country now. So what you have faced in 50 years in Afghanistan, Afghans are to blame too. They in many cases, they failed to serve their people. They serve their factions, themselves. They fax the individuals. But they have to be blamed too. But at the same time, the environment was created by international system.
Thank you. No more questions from the audience?
Panelists have discussed Afghanistan being a foreign policy priority for the United States from a security perspective. But they've forgotten to discuss Afghanistan as a resource-rich mineral in Central Asia. And the US today in searching for critical minerals all over the world to compete the China. And because the China is controlling a lot of mineral resources, critical minerals all over the world. That comes back to the question of trade and economic competition between the United States and China. And of course, the U.S. have been involved in Afghanistan within the past 20 years, doing a lot of researches about the geological and mineral research in Afghanistan. And then, of course, they left Afghanistan suddenly being a resource-rich country and left it to China. And China is now controlling and having a lot of contracts with the current regime in Afghanistan. So don't you think that the U.S. competing China and forgetting about Afghanistan resources and leaving for China to control more resources, how that the U.S. is now, the current administration being transactional administration and searching for critical minerals, don't you think that they have forgotten about the resources of Afghanistan can be a potential for the U.S. that can help the U.S. to compete with China economically for the critical mineral resources?
Thank you. I think you referred your question to Ambassador Newman, right?
I was afraid you were going to come to that conclusion. Although this is interesting because it ties back to this very good point that Ms. Mohammed made, that you as Afghans need to be looking at how you can influence U.S. policy, which means you have to break away from a view that has dominated Afghan politics as long as I've been involved, which is that you're a victim, that America has a view and you have to figure out what the view is, and then you have to somehow work within it. And that was true at one point for a very short period of time, and it became less and less true, but nobody believed that. So this is a question, are minerals potentially a lever on U.S. policy? Maybe, but a very weak one would be my guess. There is a lot of research which was done by the U.S. Geological Survey. There are some very interesting things in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, some of the most interesting deposits sit in places like Kandahar and Helmand. Not easy places to work. Getting agreements would be hard. It'd be hard to do. It's not impossible. But I don't know whether, if you ask, how can minerals leverage the United States? With this administration, they're as likely to leverage them to work with the Taliban for cooperation as they are to work for opposition. If the minerals are interesting to the United States, the short-term way to get them is in cooperation with the Taliban. Opposing the Taliban, leverage, changing governments, those are very long-term policies. So I don't think this is a very strong, I think it may have an interest. I do not think it is a very effective lever for any of the directions that people in this room would be interested in going.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Because this is not a new issue. This was looked at in the first Trump administration when you had a legitimate government in place. And there's so many challenges to exploiting mineral resources. One thing to have those resources, great, but you have to be able to exploit them. And it takes rule of law, it takes security, it takes business interest. You have to have the right business investment environment, and none of these things are there in Afghanistan. And even though the Chinese bought up the Maze Anak copper mine, 15, 20 years ago, it's not been productive.
2007.
2007, okay, so not quite.
18 years. Yeah.
18 years ago. It's not been productive.
And they haven't done anything.
I think that's a major thing that has to be considered. How feasible really is this?
Yeah, Dr.
I think there is some misperception about Chinese investment in Afghanistan. China always has been low-cost approaches in Afghanistan investments. You know, you remember the Miss Ainak. They had a contract, and they were committed to that contract as long as that area's security was provided by 10th Mountain Division. And the police was paid by Japanese. And by the time that disappeared, they said, okay, let's renegotiate the contract. Today, too, it's a very small projects that China is doing. China is moving very cautiously at a very low cost, commitment to Afghanistan. Therefore, I think you should not, this is misperception that okay, since the Taliban came, China is going to invade the country and invest in the minerals of Afghanistan. It is not going. Mineral, as I said, extraction of it is not easy, very expensive. It is very, very capital, a lot of capital. It is not, I don't think this is an issue. If there is a competition between the great power with China, that's in Pacific areas, Indo-Pacific area, not in the other areas, maybe.
In Central Asia or South?
Right, yeah.
Central Asia. Okay, so that brings us to ask the panel, given everything said today, what are the policy options that the U.S. has on Afghanistan? What are, I would say, from full recognition of the Taliban regime to engagement without normalization or recognition to a full isolation like the 1990s. I'm sure there are other options as well and levels of engagement as well. So what are the policy options that the United States has got on Afghanistan?
Well, I would say the best option might be one of limited conditional engagement with the Taliban, and that every time the U.S. Sits down with the Taliban leader, they should be raising women's rights, human rights, civil rights, inclusive governance. I think that there is going to be a necessity for the U.S. to engage with Taliban.
Mentioning human rights, women's rights, and inclusive government.
Yes.
Where are the American interests in these values?
Well, I'll say it again. I believe that the way women and girls are treated in Afghanistan is directly related to whether that country will again become a terrorist safe haven. I think there's a link between whether or not women are receiving an education, whether or not they're part of the socio-economic, political life of the country, and how extremist that society will become over time, and how much it will foster the growth of terrorist groups. So I see a direct link between the two. So yes, I believe women's security is national security. And I must admit to you, I did not come up with that on my own. That was said by former National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, who was one of the biggest supporters of the Women, Peace and Security law, that legislation, as was Ivanka Trump. She was a big supporter of the WPS law that now our Secretary of Defense is saying, he wants to remove any requirements for the U.S. government to be held accountable to that law, which is, very unfortunate.
So you're suggesting that the United States should have a limited and conditioned engagement with the Taliban. Okay, thank you so much. Ms. Mehran, what do you think what are the policy options that the United States has got on Afghanistan which would support and protect human rights and women's rights as well?
I don't want to see women's rights or discuss women's rights and human rights as its independent thing. Anywhere, especially in context of Afghanistan, when we are engaging in dealing and speaking about Taliban, it's very interconnected, and whatever happened in this space will come with compounded impact in everywhere else. That's for sure certain thing. On policy options, there are a few things that we should push for. First, I think from Biden administration up to President Trump, when we are saying that Afghanistan is not a priority on list of this administration, that yes, it's maybe not as important for them, or they are not urgently engaging with it as Ukraine, but it's there. There are policies, they are speaking about it within the administration, within the Congress. There are people who are working on those policies, reviewing it. So what I would say is, what we can push for, and hopefully the administration continue doing, is keep and remain its policy alignment on certain issues with the UN. That's what have been happening under Biden administration too, and then in the past 3 months of Trump administration. The first one is non-recognition of the Taliban. We need to make sure that we push the Taliban are not recognized as a legitimate government of Afghanistan. The second one is, which is more important, not giving Afghanistan seat in the United Nations to the Taliban, which US as a Security Council member has major role in it, and there is an interesting politics going on there between China and United States government trying to take pinholdership of the Afghanistan within the UN, which is an interesting thing. Hopefully we, as people of Afghanistan, see how that plays out there. The third thing is asset freeze. We need to make sure the Taliban do not access Afghanistan assets, and as long as they are not respecting, so that's, I think, the third thing. And then the fourth thing that is important within the United States that should be adopted, even in counterterrorism or detainees, is a priority in regard to Afghanistan for the US government. We need to make sure they respect their own laws. Women, Peace and Security Agenda 1325, yes, it's something of a UN, but within US, it is a public law. And actually, it was issued and ratified as a law under the first Trump administration. And I think, as Lisa mentioned before too, when you go and hear Waltz and Rubio and a lot of other people they call women, peace and security as something very important. So that piece of law is there. How much we can push that through any agenda that they shape for Afghanistan. In terms of engagement, I think how we can, because yes, US is a very strong country, but it's not alone when we discuss it within the framework of Doha or Mosaic or some other political roadmaps that are being discussed in regard to Afghanistan, how we can then hopefully utilize and mobilize other actors in this space that their interest is aligned with the US interest, not only ours. I think it needs a lot of work and a lot of discussion there. But lastly, I think you mentioned it in one of the questions too, whatever United States government think, the most important thing is you cannot defeat terrorists with terrorists. You just cannot defeat it. And then these discussions of Taliban 2, the reformed Taliban, were during the negotiations too, and Taliban didn't do any of those promises, didn't deliver any of those promises that they made with the US government or the first Trump administration during the negotiation that happened, that they brought Taliban to Afghanistan. Taliban didn't win any war. So I think these are the discussions and policy priorities that should be reflected or influence how the policy toward Afghanistan is shaped. That's one thing. But the other thing that I believe for is importance of using accountability mechanisms that women of Afghanistan, people of Afghanistan have been pushing for. Naming three big things, it includes codification of gender apartheid, it includes ICC, that I know US is not a very big fan of, and ICJ, International Criminal Justice Court. Why those things are important? Because it's not only about Afghanistan. Yes, at the international stage, we are seeing regress and regression on women's rights and a lot of rule of and importance of international legal system. I think it can be a push for that. The other thing is, yes, interest of US is important, but I think there is an ethical, moral responsibility of if US has caused Afghanistan to become a regime of gender apartheid, I am sure there will be some interest in terms of through Doha or any other platform they want to engage with Afghanistan, that they change the current system. No one wants the Taliban to be recognized, including US government. And my belief on accountability mechanisms are, it gives us a framework that we as people of Afghanistan internally communicate our grievances within that framework. Because no one ignored the ethnic tensions, no one ignored the geographic location of Afghanistan, and a lot of other dynamics that is very internal, and any policy should be contextualized within that. What I am saying is, if gender apartheid gets codified, if we have an ICJ process that works, we as different ethnicities, we as different interests, we also can come and talk to each other instead of going to another civil war. Because if the Taliban continues, we're gonna face another...
What are the mechanisms and platforms for people of Afghanistan to come together and talk?
So gender apartheid is one of those things. Because what happened during 2001, when the Bonn Conference happened, US intervened with military forces. It didn't allow us to do anything within the transitional justice system, right? That would help then, I think, even Afghanistan government to be more sustainable. Because I think as a framework, either ICJ, International Criminal Court, or codification of gender apartheid gave that platform that we speak about our grievances, yes, locally, that hopefully if I see the Taliban leaders going to a court and being, at least that recognition I think gives solace to many people inside Afghanistan, but also that's why it's important for me, it creates legal obligation for other countries, including US, to act more responsibly towards Afghanistan.
Thank you.
I hope we should push for all of that.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jalali, so many things have been raised here. But what do you think, what are the policy options that US has on Afghanistan? And do you think the internal issues of the Taliban, the internal rifts between Kandahari Taliban and Khosti Taliban, Haqqani Network and Haibatullah and others could, affect, the overall Taliban regime and US policy towards the Taliban?
Thank you. I think there is no clear policy on Afghanistan in the United States yet.
But
Maybe it is shaping now.
Options, yeah.
But the options in the past 3 or 4 years, there were a lot of debates in Washington on how to deal with Taliban policy options. Usually there are the engagement, isolation, opposition, all these things were debated by think tanks and also in the media and also in the conferences and meetings. At the beginning, I think it was the isolation. Isolation didn't work because the leverage of recognition and the leverage of sanctions did not change the Taliban. And on the other hand, isolation cannot be effective if one country or all countries do not do it. Many countries are engaging the Taliban. Even if they say 20 countries access their diplomats, they have trade relations with them. China has even exchanged ambassador with them. Russia is about to, remove them from the books of, yeah. And then Kazakhstan and Tajikistan did the same thing. Iran is doing the same thing in Pakistan. So isolation didn't work.
But the question is, did the United States try to isolate the Taliban this time?
Because
from the beginning, there was engagement from day one.
No, I'm talking at the beginning. I said that isolation was suggested to be again.
Yeah.
But it didn't work because the leverage
was never
not there.
Dr. Jalal, it was not, isolation of the Taliban was never tried after their return to power. There was always engagement.
It was engagement to some extent. But isolation, all these the sanctions and freezing the assets, all these are all the isolation, and not recognizing it as a government. That's isolation. But now the isolation didn't work, so that partial engagement actually started to work on certain issues, as we discussed before. For the future, I don't know. I think what is recommended here in Washington during these debates, as Lisa actually referred to it, is a kind of conditional engagement on issues in a kind of a transactional way. Is it working or not? The second question that we have.
Yeah.
Who are Taliban? Taliban is adhering to a kind of a ideological, radical kind of exceptionalism. They control the country through a kind of totalitarian governance, controlling everything, all aspects of life, and maintaining also relations with extremist groups in the region and beyond. This complicates two things. This complicates a balance between the driver and ideology and the demands to run an effective government. On the other hand, this also complicates the kind of a mutually beneficial relationship with the international community. So that is the kind of a regime. Now, you are talking about whether the dissent, or I mean the internal dispute that they have at work. Internal dispute works only when it does not undermine the survival of the regime. You know, change and security are two things in these kind of regimes. They should not change to the extent that undermine the regime. So currently, I think, Haqqani and others, they're not practical. But they know that rocking the boat too much is going to kind of either a civil war, nobody wants that, or it will be kind of the weakness of the regime. So I don't think Haqqani are ready to take that risk. They tried, but they blinked, I think, finally. Now, with these kind of regimes that change, come from within usually. You mean within the group or within the country? Within the system. Either with the look at the Soviet Union, look at China, look at it. They come through the change of leadership. Stalin to, Khrushchev or from to Deng Xiaoping. A change of leadership, or a kind of economic crisis, stagnation. And finally, in that kind of a situation, probably internal dispute can change that situation too.
And you think Taliban are not in that?
Not in that position now. It will really take time. How long it took Vietnam? How long it took China, Russia, Iran too? It takes time. But it comes from it. Yes, foreign pressure, restriction can work, but it's not the only way to change that regime.
What do you think of the anti-Taliban fronts like NRF and Freedom Front and others? How effective they have been?
First of all, they have not been effective for two reasons. There's no mobilization in Afghanistan. Political mobilization is always difficult. Outside Afghanistan, the diaspora, they actually cannot get together. Or some of them were discredited. On the other hand, it is very hard to say it, but this is a fact. In Afghanistan, national interests were always undermined by parochial interests, tribal interests. That's why mobilization, national mobilization, is only possible when there's a religiously, they are challenged. Otherwise, always you need a catalyst, an international catalyst to bring them together. During the jihad, I saw that Arabs were doing this. The 7 groups were fighting the Soviet Union, but they cannot get together, get along with each other, because what they wanted to do it first, they were doing it the last. First, they had to drive the Russians out. Second, to create a replacement, a government, national government. And third, to elect a leader. They do it the other way. First, elect a leader, then the kind of a government, then we will do the fighting sort out the Soviets. Today is the same thing. They need a catalyst. Bonn was a catalyst. And Bonn. Now they need a catalyst too. That catalyst is no longer there. So therefore, I don't know. On the other hand, the United States and the many other countries, including Europe, they do not want civil war in Afghanistan, because civil war as a recipe for the terrorism and extremism to actually become stronger.
Ambassador Newman, what do you think? What are the policy options that the United States has now, and what are your recommendations?
First of all, I think this ground has been pretty well covered by my colleagues. I completely agree with all the analysis you heard from Minister Jalali. If change comes, it will come. I say eventually it will come. Afghanistan always changes, but it will come from inside. I don't know how. I agree absolutely with the things that Ms. Moram said. No recognition, no seat in the UN, no access, no actions that really would strengthen the current government, because the current government in the long term is a threat to everyone around it. So no actions that strengthen it. But there are practical reasons to have some level of contact, as happens now in Doha. It's also important to maintain contact, because if change comes, the United States should be able to engage with parties. And if you say no contact, which sometimes has been a recommendation, then you become a prisoner of your own policy. Then it becomes a domestic political issue in the United States. If you want to have contact, now you have to prove you have a level of interest to resume the contact, and that is very difficult to build, and it becomes that. So if you have a time when there is some change in Afghanistan and we should engage, you find you can't. You're absolutely crippled by your own policy. So I think right now, I do not see any useful policy that will make major change in Afghanistan. I wish I did, I don't see it. So I think you don't strengthen it, you maintain all the things that Ms. Ram talked about. You maintain a tiny level of contact, but you don't engage, you don't increase it. I would prefer not to increase it particularly. And if from time to time you have a common, if you can cooperate with the Taliban to take out a common enemy, fine. You don't trust them. You don't believe it's long term. You don't assume.
But you're strengthening the Taliban by that kind of contract or engagement.
Daesh is an enemy of us both. If sometimes there is a moment to do something which weakens Daesh, fine, because that's the bigger enemy. It's a more immediate enemy. It's a closer enemy. But you don't try to build anything on that. You don't try to build a relationship on that. And you certainly don't trust the relationship. That's a very inadequate, partial policy. I just happen to believe that's about all that you have available at the present.
Can I add one policy
Sure,
recommendation?
yeah.
The U.S. should be engaging with the non-Taliban opposition at a higher level. They should be showing the Taliban that they're not the only game in town. They did not come to power through an election. They came to power through military force. They don't represent by and large, the Afghan people. So it is incumbent on this Trump administration to engage with non-Taliban Afghan leaders, opposition, whatever you want to call them. So I think that's very important because that allows the Trump administration to get some kind of leverage with the Taliban, and it strengthens those other forces and people that should be part of the political process in Afghanistan.
So when you say non-Taliban, in your suggestion, like anti-Taliban fronts, like NRF and
I think
Freedom Front, and everybody is included.
Every Afghanistan. Look, I wish there was one unified political opposition. I think they'd be a lot stronger and a lot better interlocutor for the United States, but that's just not the reality. As Professor Jalali indicated, there's still a lot of divisions among the Afghans outside of Afghanistan. So, the U.S. should be engaging with a host of these leaders.
I want to add to what Lisa said very briefly on engaging with the opposition of the Taliban. For me, I'm not a person to go for a physical war, but if people who are resisting inside Afghanistan, even militarily, are a legitimate resistance, and they should, and I respect that. Yes, U.S. government at higher level should engage with that we see some level of engagement within the Congress now. But what I also want is recognition of political legitimacy and agency of women of Afghanistan who are resisting inside. The level of violence they received from the Taliban because of civic resistance. I think they are the political force, and if you see their demands in cause, it's not limited for women's and human rights only. It's very inclusive, targeting all aspects of life. In addition to the military resistance, I think recognition of political legitimacy of women and seeing them as a valid and legitimate opposition there is very important and key.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone, our panelists and our audience in the hall. This is the end of first Amu debate. We'll see you next time.